Good morning and welcome to today's Latin American program seminar, Renewable Energy and Mining in Latin America. I am Benjamin Gadan. I am the acting director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program. Welcome. Thank you for your interest. Latin America is home to some of the largest mineral and metal reserves in the world, and the industry has enormous room for growth. Today, Chile is the largest producer of copper in the world, followed by neighboring Peru. Brazil has the second largest reserves of iron ore and is one of the top 10 nickel producers. Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile make up the so-called lithium triangle, which holds nearly 60% of the global supply. Mexico, Brazil, and Peru have also identified smaller amounts of this highly sought-after metal. For Latin America's governments, the mining sector is a potentially important economic motor at a moment when post-pandemic recovery is sputtering. On top of its plentiful pre-pandemic problems and the economic scars of COVID-19, this region is struggling with high inflation, a strong dollar, and slowing growth. These challenges have been compounded by the devastating impacts of Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, including disruptions to global food and energy supplies, with serious economic and political and social consequences throughout the Americas. On the other hand, as at other important moments in this region's history, global demand is rapidly growing for Latin America's underground riches. In addition to demand for traditional precious metals, such as gold and silver, Latin America has seen stunningly increased interest in mining critical minerals that are essential for new technologies, such as electric vehicles that will permit the global energy transition. This is true in the United States as well. These critical minerals include copper, an essential component in a variety of renewable energy systems, including solar, hydro, and wind. Latin America's lithium, sometimes called white gold, is experiencing explosive demand among battery and electric vehicle manufacturers, who also have increasing demand for copper and other minerals that are found within the Americas. That said, as governments, corporations, and consumers worldwide rush to reduce their environmental impacts, it will be critically important that the increased mining I have just described will enable the renewable energy revolution, but not undermine similar and related environmental objectives. Latin American governments, of course, have their own interests in reducing the environmental impacts of the mining industry beyond the important conservation objectives I have just described. The environmental impacts of mining locally have often provoked opposition, depriving companies of their so-called social license, and in many occasions, interrupting production. Fortunately, major global mining companies operating in Latin America are increasingly making ambitious commitments to reduce their environmental impacts, including in energy use and carbon emissions. These changes, reflecting corporate interest, changing stakeholder demands, new regulations, all involve substantial investments in the development and deployment of new technologies and in operational innovations. To discuss how Latin America's mining industry is moving to sharply reduce emissions and other environmental impacts, I'm delighted to introduce an impressive group of senior executives and experts. Christina Bruce is Vice President for Corporate Affairs, Permitting and Environment for Anglo American in Chile. Brianna Gunn is the Group Executive of Environment at Newmont. Renee Muga is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs of Minerals America at BHP. And Jenna Schroeder is the team lead of the Energy and Mineral Governance Program at the United States Department of State. Welcome all of you, and thanks for being here. Before we begin, I want to express my appreciation to my team at the Wilson Center's Latin American program, including Anders Biel, Beatriz Garcia-Nice, Oscar Cruz, and Sophia Schuchner for their help in organizing today's important discussion. I also want to thank our co-sponsor, Newmont, whose support helps us produce research and events on these important topics. Thank you all. Let me begin, if I could, with you, Brianna. And I want to talk about the factors that are driving Newmont and other companies in your sector to take very seriously the issues that I've just outlined. The variety, the constellation of stakeholders who are driving what is a pretty significant shift, I would say, though not a new one necessarily, in how companies like yours approach environmental impacts.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you for having us today. It's really Newmont's values and purpose that are driving us to make this change, and the recognition that our industry, the mining industry as well, plays a role in addressing climate change and supporting the communities in which we operate and adapting and being resilient. So Newmont has a purpose to create value and improve lives through responsible and sustainable mining. We really have a robust governance system that combines a holistic approach to ESG and a strategy with metrics and targets to make sure that we are measuring what's important to our business, to communities, and other stakeholders. It's Newmont's sustainability and stakeholder engagement policy that acknowledges that human activities contribute to climate change and that businesses like ourselves play a key role in addressing this global challenge. And our policy is really our commitment to say that we need to manage our energy consumption and identify opportunities to transition to renewable and low carbon energy sources more efficiently. We established a climate and energy strategy in 2016 to really align with that policy statement. That also looks at what ICMM is doing, the International Council on Mining and Metals, in their position statement in there, and is aligned with the Paris Agreement's objectives to limit global temperature rise. So it's really all of these things that are driving us to push forward.
Excellent. Many thanks, Brianna. Christina, let me turn to you and talk about the implementation of a vision of the kind that Brianna just described. One imagines that this industry, which has been around for quite a while, is an intense user of energy and has had other environmental impacts that have long seemed unavoidable, would be shifting based on pretty substantial investments in operational change and in new technologies in order to realize these environmental objectives. What has it required in terms of research and development, creativity, financial investment, long-term thinking, so that the industry can really pivot in the ways that we're talking about here?
Thanks, Benjamin. I think just to build on what Brianna has said, the scale of what we need to achieve as an industry, I think, means that there is no one specific solution. There is no one magic piece of technology that's going to achieve all of our goals. So this is about systemic change, and to create that, we need pieces of the puzzle that all then need to come together. So what has Anglo done? I mean, I think from an innovation and technologies perspective, we have an innovation program called Future Smart that has sought to recognize that for hundreds of years, the mining industry relied on the same basic concepts of technology. And so we've sought to develop technologies that radically change the footprint of mining, so significantly reduce the amount of energy that we use, and will significantly reduce the amount of water that we use in our processing. Examples would be something we call bulk ore sorting, and the concept of that is that you sort your rocks before you grind them, therefore only grinding the more valuable rocks and avoiding the use of energy to grind rocks that are less valuable. And then something we call coarse particle recovery, which is to try and extract the precious pieces from larger pieces of rock. So therefore, again, you use less energy in grinding, and it's easier to take the water out of your processing. So those are two examples of technologies that we've developed, that we are piloting and rolling out across some of our operations in Latin America. And examples of that innovation program. I think the other big area that Anglo has invested heavily in is hydrogen. So as one of the main producers of platinum in the world, platinum is used to create hydrogen. We've invested extensively in the development of new technologies. This year, we launched the first mining truck, haulage truck that is totally run by hydrogen. And the goal is to roll that out across more of our mines, thereby trying to eliminate at least 80% of diesel from our chain. So So again, those are some examples. The hydrogen piece, it's a really good example of that systemic change. One truck is not enough. A fleet of trucks is not enough. You need the production of green hydrogen. You need the entire infrastructure around that. But that's the direction that we're headed in. So those are two examples. I can give more, but I think for now that I hope gives a feel.
It certainly does. I actually just want to follow up a little bit about the kind of general price tag of what you're describing. I mean, talking about systemic change, new fleets of trucks, the research and development of these technologies, it just doesn't sound inexpensive. What is the kind of discussion internally when some members of the company are advocating these investments, others looking at the bottom line and more short-term financial considerations? What is that conversation like in the boardroom when someone advocates for the kinds of technologies to be developed and rolled out that you've just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think all businesses have to continually balance the short term versus the long term when you're making long-term financial decisions. I think it helps a little bit because the mining industry is so used to making long-term investment decisions anyway, by their very nature. We're talking 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So I think that is something that helped. I really would not underestimate the power of purpose. Brianna spoke of Newmont's purpose. Anglo Americans is a very strong driver in the decisions that we make, and it really has united our leadership, and I think was a critical part of facilitating the investment in some of these technologies. And there is also the recognition that this is critical for the future of our industry and our planet. So society will not accept an industry that doesn't respond and that doesn't try and find some of these solutions. And then secondly, with the support of government policy, there is a first mover advantage, we very much hope. So our hydrogen truck is not just ultimately for Anglo, but we hope will be a good business proposition more broadly as our technologies, but that's in the future. But I think those are some of the key components that drive some of the decisions.
Renee, when Christina says society won't accept certain practices in certain industries, in this case, mining and environmental impacts, I'd love to understand exactly what that means on the ground, the kinds of disruptions to production that companies like the ones that are participating today can experience when they lose the so-called social license, when local communities, indigenous groups and others who are directly impacted by mining no longer feel that the environmental considerations and social values are being reflected in corporate decisions. What does that actually look like on the ground? How can it disrupt operations? Why is it so important that companies are able to obtain and comply with this so-called social license?
Yes, well, thank you for the invitation. First of all, this is a very relevant question because I think we are in the process of transitioning to an economy which is decarbonized, which is electrified, and for that we need resources, and resources are needed to be produced. Our estimation is in the next 10, 20 years we will use more copper than has been used so far in whole our history. So it's a real challenge that we are facing for the next decades in this path. And of course, when you see the last issue, the EY risk report for the mining industry, you see what are the main challenges: ESG, climate change, geopolitics. So I think everyone is certain that we will need a lot of resources to be produced for the new world that we are transitioning to. But this is the real challenge. How we can do that, in a way that everyone understands that these are needs, but also that we need to change the way in which we are producing and we are facing this challenge. In the case of BHP, we have decided to be very, very vocal and very active, bringing into this discussion the concept of social value, which means that when we produce and when we look at the profits, it's not just because we are thinking in a very narrow perspective. We are thinking that our contribution should be positive for the economy, for the environment, for our customers, for our employees, and for all our social and environment. And so we are not looking just for how we produce more and get more metal and more minerals and particularly more future-facing commodities, as we say, and this is our focus today in BHP: copper, nickel, iron, and natural fertilizers as key elements for this new world. But the way in which we produce and the way in which we conceive, as our new DNA, this positive contribution that we are making by producing and, I would say, approaching, these challenges in a different concept. Our concept of social value is something that perhaps we can talk later on. There's several pillars that covers, a very wide range of challenges that we have to face when we think that whatever we need to supply the new decarbonized and electrified world need to be produced in a different way.
Thank you, Renee. Jenna, the Biden administration has spoken from the very beginning a lot about environmental conservation, about climate issues, about the energy transition, and has also focused very heavily on the need to ramp up mining, which some see as a contradiction, given the history of environmental impacts, the heavy energy use involved in that sector. It's that contradiction that I want to talk to you about, Jenna. I mean, as Renee and others have pointed out, to realize the dreams of the energy transition, to provide the responses to the climate crisis will require a lot more of these very resources. To produce them, however, has raised a lot of concerns about whether they can be produced at a greater scale without ramping up the environmental impacts and the energy use that would undermine the objectives of the energy transition. Your office, Jen, at the State Department is trying to thread that needle, both encouraging the greater production of these minerals to safeguard US critical mineral supply chains, while encouraging the kinds of best practices that we're debating right now. I'm just curious in general, and then we can get into the specific kinds of technical assistance that you help supervise. How do you see balancing those administration priorities?
Yeah, certainly. And thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I think in my building, we view engagement in this sector as critical to the work that we do globally to support the clean energy transition. My bureau, ENR, is really focused on the geopolitics of the clean energy transition. And increasingly over the last 3 or 4 years, we've realized that we have to focus on critical minerals and critical mineral supply chains and governance, because we know how essential those technologies are to that transition. I serve as the team lead for the Energy and Mineral Governance Program, which partners with governments around the world, including in Latin America, to cooperate and share best practices and build capacity for sustainably managing these sectors. This is all under the umbrella of a program we call ERGI, or the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, which helps countries build reliable, sustainable critical mineral supply chains that importantly respect ESG standards. So we've worked throughout Latin America and the Caribbean to help countries boost mining capacity and investment. Myself and my team manage projects in countries like Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, and other places, partnering there with governments in these sectors. Since fall 2019, we've actually spent over $25 million globally, working in about 15 countries around the world on these issues. But beyond ERGI and more recently, my bureau has spearheaded international cooperation under the Mineral Security Partnership, or MSP, which you might have heard in the news over the last couple months. This initiative essentially works to diversify critical mineral supply chains by catalyzing investment in specific projects that adhere to the highest ESG standards. And I think it's really important because we can't overstate the importance of ESG standards to these development efforts. I think this kind of gets to the point that the question that you raised, Ben: how do we walk this line? And we know, for example, our Undersecretary Jose Fernandez likes to say that we need to work together to create a race to the top for ESG and to help transform the global mineral sector. And I think we've heard that from some of the other panelists here today. Not only is it not reputationally something that that consumers will tolerate, but I think it's really important that to the social license issue, that in order to get the buy-in we need from communities, that the benefits and advantages of mineral development are shared by local governments, local communities. And then the way that we do that is by signaling with mineral supply and offtake agreements, with public investment, that high ESG standards, including with renewables, are worth the added cost, and that responsible investors will pay the difference. And we're already seeing markets move that way now. And so for that reason, I think ESG, including renewables, a focus on greening the mining sector, it's all really critical to the work that we do globally with partners under MSP, under ERGI, and in our work in Latin America.
Jenna, before I let you go, I'm intrigued by the discussion of the geopolitics of this question that you've raised. The United States and US and Western companies are hardly the only actors in Latin America that are engaging in mining right now, that are seeking a bigger footprint in the Americas. How do you see that sort of competition? Who are the good actors globally who are engaged in what you've described as a race to the top, and who are others that are more focused on other priorities that are different than the kind of social and environmental considerations that your team is hoping to partner in the region and promote it?
I think it's really important that you focus on activities and on what mining build out looks like, particularly in the upstream. We obviously welcome cooperation, we welcome competition and investment from any responsible company. And I think you see that play out in the way that companies comport themselves on the ground. And so what we've heard from other panelists today, the way that they're pursuing greening their operations, the way that companies pursue social license, the kind of early and often consultation with communities, that's what makes projects successful. And so I think it's a lot more helpful, instead of focusing on geopolitics, to focus on what it is companies are doing. And it's possible that those blur those geopolitical lines. But I'd say really we just want to, like I mentioned, it should be a race to the top. And so if we can encourage other countries to encourage their companies to adhere to really strong ESG standards, then I think we have done our job, honestly.
Brianna, I want to now get into a bit more detail about the kinds of environmental impacts that companies like Newmont are seeking to minimize, even as you expand output. And you mentioned earlier an important one, which is energy. This is something that companies can take on their own, generating on-site various types of energy. But it's obviously a bit more convenient to have the support of local, regional, and national governments, to have access to renewable energy, to have power purchase agreements, the kind of regulatory environment that makes it easier for companies like yours to power your operations in a more sustainable way. So I'd love if you could answer kind of both. What are and can you do on your own? And what do you hope to get from the partner governments in the countries in which you operate that make it easier to rely upon renewable energy to power your very energy intensive operations?
Thanks. That's a lot. But I think that first of all, what we did on our own was try to get an understanding of our profile and where we were really having heavy emissions. So for us, the majority of our emissions for our scope 1, so our direct, and then scope 2, which is from our power, are coming from either directly from the grid, so the energy that we have available, or from our diesel usage. There is some from other areas, but so based on that, on the terms of scope 1, there are direct things we can do. We can put in more energy efficient projects at the site level where we use less diesel. We can do other types of work where we transition from diesel usage to electric usage. One of the areas that we have right now is our strategic alliance with Caterpillar, which we refer to as Cat Zero. And it was really our thought as an opportunity to be able to lead fundamental change in the mining industry and help them rapidly develop and deploy all electric autonomous mining systems for ourselves as well as for other organizations, and to be able to work with them to show how we could take our existing technology and really transition that over into a different one. So we're working with them to transition that and look through that piece. The other part that we can do is look at our power sources. So we have contracts agreements in place where we go out and we get power from other systems. So there is the ability to be able to contract and get those systems in place. What we have, though, is some constraints and competition around that. So specifically in areas where we work, where there has been government policies set around specific targets, Australia is one, where there's been a major transition, there will be competition to be able to get that renewable energy. And so the other thing that we have to look at is what's the opportunity for us to do build our own type system, build our own, or work in collaboration with those OEMs that are out there to be able to partner and develop systems back for the grid to be able to work. So it has to kind of be a combined approach. And so as we were working through and developing our pathway, we're looking at different systematic ways. I wanted to note also in something that Christina said, I think that helping our sites understand where they can do better and evaluate decarbonization is important. So we have a program across the company that's called Full Potential. And part of that is just looking at how we can resource and reduce work. And we've pulled energy and decarbonization into that as a way to help the sites say, all right, if we do these types of projects, they actually also support reduction in water, reduction in energy usage, reduction in our impact to biodiversity. So I think it's really also internally helping people understand what the work we're doing has, what the impact it has, and where they can better improve. And then just one other thing, and we'll probably come back to it, I'm sure, but really local governance and policies is really important. It's something that's really important, I think, for us as an industry to be able to make significant improvement as we move forward, and having those policies and systems really align with where we're trying to go, and or setting specific metrics, I think is what's going to help drive people outside of large industry that have the money, financial backing to do it, to make those changes as well.
Thanks, Brianna. Christina, same question for you. Sort of how are you sorting out ways when it comes to reducing energy use or using a greater percentage of renewables in your matrix? You know, how are you balancing the need to do it in-house with the availability of it elsewhere, with government regulation that could make it easier and more affordable to transition in that direction?
Thanks. I think it's a little ties into where I started with my previous response, which is it's a bit of everything. So it's a piece of all of these. So it is about securing, aiming to secure renewable energy supplies. So as of the end of this year, 2022, all of Anglo American's energy is sourced from renewables across Latin America. And then we are aiming to achieve the same in Southern Africa in a different way. So it's about securing those agreements. In Chile, our first move, again, slightly different subject, was to make sure that all of our transportation buses for colleagues are electric. And then we have an e-mobility program to roll that out to all other vehicles in the entire system. So it's pieces that then all come together to contribute to a whole. I've outlined some of the innovation programs that we have. Hydrogen is really key for us. And then, of course, we are looking, like all industries, we're looking at offsets, what offsets actually mean, the degree to which they will be acceptable in terms of purchasing them or developing our own offset projects as is required. And again, that's a path that I think a lot of companies are on. So it's a full range.
Christina, at the risk of being undiplomatic, I'd love to ask if Anglo's ability to transition toward fully renewable energy use was because of or despite local regulatory and national government policies in the Americas. You know, have you found obstacles? Have you found the right incentives, the right partners in government? You know, what's your observation about the role that the region's leadership has played in enabling companies like yours to transition to renewables?
I think the honest answer is I wasn't involved in the details. So it's not about being diplomatic or not. What I can say is that we've achieved it. We've achieved it with international established companies that operate in the countries that we are in. Good long-term agreements that are commercially appropriate for all parties involved. So I don't think there are blockages that I would identify because we've managed to do it that far. But to give you a bit more flavor to I think where you're trying to drive at, the role of government is key in this. Jenna was talking about carrot and stick, or she was talking to a drive to the top, and as she was speaking, I was thinking actually it's a combination of carrot and stick. What's the role of government? Government can incentivize. For example, one of the many of the conversations we've had around our innovation programs is how do you permit innovation? To what degree can do permitting systems facilitate new technologies that are unknown, unproven? Traditionally, permitting processes are very focused on what you're going to do rather than the input. So how much water, how much energy you're going to consume, and as long as if you had a permitting system where you focused on those outputs or those inputs rather than exactly what you were going to do, there might be a little more flexibility. But that only works if governments have appropriate levels of oversight, because of course they need to make sure that companies behave appropriately within the parameters of what permits have established. So governments are absolutely key to this. They're also key to encouraging systemic change and making the pieces fit together. So, for example, Chile has huge potential when it comes to hydrogen. The Chilean government has, for multiple governments now, has supported as a long-term hydrogen strategy. And then we need to bring all the players together. It can't just be one company or government alone. And so to create those forums, government can have a really strong convening power there as well. That give you some ideas.
Excellent. Renee, same question for you about strategies to reduce energy use, to transition to renewable energy, partnerships or obstacles from local, regional, national government. How have you found the environment when looking at your own, again, internal goals to move in that direction? Have you found that, the Americas is a convenient place to make this transition, or a cumbersome environment?
Certainly, the Americas is a convenient place. We have a lot of supply of renewable sources of energy, but I think complementing the question from the answer from Christina, I think you need also to have your decision, very. Of course, there are, the regulatory environment and the role that the government plays and the supplier of energy plays, but you have to take decisions that probably are bold at the beginning. When, for instance, when BHP decided to go to desal water 15 years ago, there was the pioneering, mining company that did that. All the rest of the companies say, well, you're crazy. Why? If you have water here, why are you going to get water from the sea? 15 years after, everyone is going for desal water. Well, we were the first one that made a tough decision. 4 billion.
Your desalinization is the process.
Yes, desalinization. Yeah. We spent $4 billion in that investment. That at the beginning was really, out of your mind. Yeah? But now it's standard. The same happened when we decided to go to renewable PPAs of energy. That was a lot of questions and a lot of and a tough decision. It cost us almost $1 billion, to change and to suspend the contracts that were supplied by no renewables, and to go and change it for other providers of energy, so that early termination cost us a lot of, but that was a decision to really go into transition, because if we are providing, the resources that the world need for making the decarbonization process real, then we have also, to create value in that process, and that mean, that also you have to commit, and you have to share, that prosperity, also implying that you have to, show also that I would say that decision in the process, which make you a credible actor, in this. In this process. So scope 2 in terms of energy is something that we achieved already. Scope 1 is a challenge, because we have to make, a lot of changes in the way we move materials from within our own operations. And scope 3 also, involving the rest of the value chain also in this regard. And we are doing a lot of, approaches to our suppliers, to our providers, with the transportation of the mineral. And so I think in the coming years, you will see also a lot of movement in the way in which we go, progressively, in the process of also reducing our emissions in scope 1 and in scope 3.
Thank you, Renee. Jenna, you have to have a counterpart when you want to provide the kind of technical assistance that you've been describing. I think there's some anxiety given the economic challenges in Latin America that I described in my introductory remarks, that the direction of the race would be to the bottom and not the top, that the desperation for mining investment would mean that countries might be less discriminating in terms of what companies they partner with, which countries are providing that investment, and that the eagerness would be, with the exception of a few governments that are, ran on environmental platforms, simply to expedite the mining process and the production and export of these minerals, and not to give a lot of consideration to the kind of principles that you've been describing that the State Department is drawing attention to, these being environmental and social above all. So my question, Jen, is as you've thought about the work you do within Latin America, you've mentioned Argentina, Brazil, who have been the governments that have been most eager to partner with you in assuring that mining sector expansion is done in a way that's perhaps different than the past and very respectful of environmental and social goals?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to pick favorites, but I did just actually return from a trip to Argentina last week, and as an aside, I was up in the Altiplano area, the Puna, right? This is an area that is shared by Argentina, by Chile, by Peru, by Bolivia, and I got to witness firsthand not only kind of the build out of the mining sector, particularly lithium in that area, but also the tremendous potential for solar and what those governments are doing to expand solar in that area. The Altiplano has, I think, the highest solar irradiance in the world. And we got to drive by on the border between Salta and Jujuy provinces, the two large solar installations that are there. And I say like large, they're quite large. On the Jujuy side, they currently have, I think, 330 megawatts of solar built out. On the Salta side across the road, 200 megawatts of solar. We heard that there are, late stage plans for an additional 200 megawatts of solar, which will bring it to close to 800 megawatts just for that area, including some solar thermal hybrid expansions. And so particularly given the transmission and distribution lines that you have coming over from Chile, build out in this area is kind of a no-brainer. And to your point, I mean, the governments, not only the federal government, but in Argentina, understanding how important the provinces are in this section, are really, really committed to this. I mean, Cauchari Ojos, that project is already using some of this solar. A lot of the solar in that area is going to the grid. But there's just a tremendous opportunity in this area for all of these countries to build out these kinds of renewables and use them to supply their projects. And so I think, in my dealings with governments, particularly in Argentina, but also some of the others that you've mentioned, there is a very strong commitment to this kind of work. And, I think the build out of these projects in these areas is testament to that, right? They could have, accepted projects that didn't bring this kind of investment in renewables, but they didn't. They pushed for it, and in the end, they were able to achieve it. And so I think it's, when I talk to governments, this is something they're extremely focused on, and it's not just because they realize the importance, like I said before, to the companies my panelists represent, but also because they understand that this is reputational. There's a reputational risk to doing this incorrectly and doing this wrong, and their citizens simply won't stand for it. And so if they can point to these kinds of investments in power, particularly, it helps, I think, bolster the reputation of the mining sector as one that brings quality investment like this to the region. And so, I've just heard nothing but support for these kinds of initiatives in this kind of work.
Brianna, I'm glad Jen has brought up this issue of reputational risk for the industry, for the governments themselves. There's still a lot of skepticism about mining, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that in the environmental community and some local communities, including in Latin America. We talked a little bit earlier with Renee what some of the consequences of that can be with protest and disruption, with loss of regulatory support. I just want to understand sort of why. I mean, if based on the conversation we've had, it seems the companies are highly committed. The governments recognize that. The importance of social license seems to be widely understood. Why, when I travel to places like Jenna mentioned in Northwest Argentina, in the areas where there's lithium mining and lots of other mineral extraction, you do find anti-mining graffiti and local political and social actors very skeptical about the kinds of commitments that you're describing to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, there are people out there that are anti-mining, really around not really understanding what the value is or the holistic economic value that mining can bring, and that's always going to be the case. I think, you know, there are also factors out there that understand that when you come and you mine in an area, that you are having impact, and you're having impact for some period of time. But I think what the piece is that's important to us, important to help, is people understanding that in order for us to transition to a greener economy, that mining is needed, right? There are specific resources that are needed to help support that transition. There are things right now that are needed for mining for people to live on a regular basis and have their lives. And I think it's really helping people support and understand that. And then also, I believe that it's our job to help understanding where we're having impact and reduce it to the extent possible. And then helping people understand what that change is going to look like, but also really working hand in hand with governments, with stakeholders, with communities to say, you know, what do we, as we're here for this time period, what's the most value that we can bring as we transition out of operations and into closure? How do we work together to come up with this post-mine land use that works for everybody, and that's really supportive of maintaining this economic value that we've established here? So I think it's really part of our role to help support that bigger understanding of what's happening. But I think there will always continue to be people, you know, that don't understand or are against mining coming in at all for that case. So I think just as we work together, we can continue to do things like this so people to understand really what's happening, but also really working with those local communities to get that social acceptance, as well as to help support their understanding of economic value now and into the future that mining can bring.
Yeah, Christina, the same question for you, which is, you know, the historical legacy of this industry in Latin America, its current profile and reputation, and, you know, how and, you know, what ways are you telling a different story right now, you know, based on the kinds of technological investments you've made and the transition in energy use that you've undertaken? You know, how important is it, and in what ways are you telling that story?
Thank you. I think it's really important to recognize that we are an industry that brings a lot of legacies with it. And so there are just too many examples out there of where mining companies have got it wrong, where mining companies have been fined, where mining companies haven't managed to deal with their legacies. And as an industry and as a company, we need to 100% work on that. And people's memories are long, and of course they're long because often these are people's grandparents or people's parents, and so moving an industry that has a bad legacy forward is always going to take time. I think the second point is that when we talk about you know, renewable energy, carbon neutrality, scope 1, 2, 3, it's meaningless to many people, particularly people that experience the day-to-day impacts of living right next to a mine, even if that mine has been significantly changing its performance and its behavior. So what we as companies need to do, and what Anglo American is trying to do, is transform the way that we do things. And I think just two examples of that. Firstly, we are looking at a just transition and what a just transition means. I know there's big debate about what the term means, but for this purpose, for this conversation, I think it's just you know, our environmental goals are accompanied and sit close to our social goals. Our objective to create 5 jobs off-site for every 1 job on-site, because as this change happens, we need to support the communities around our mines to be able to have the livelihoods linked to those changes. So, you know, hydrogen, how are we going to support jobs in hydrogen as we promote that hydrogen economy? so that would be my first example. And then my second is about how we as a company have had to learn. And we recently started production at our new copper mine in Peru, which is very, very exciting. Took us many, many years to develop. When I joined Anglo in 2012, we'd just been through a period where the project was totally paralyzed because of community concerns around water. And what did we have to do? We had to redesign the project. So we had to recognize that the communities didn't trust our plans to deviate a river, make a very strong commitment around that. We had to completely change our water supply in order to accommodate for our local communities' needs and interests. And it's only once we were able to do that and incorporate that into our project planning that we were then able to unfreeze the project. And then you accelerate to now 2022, and we're managing to produce copper, and it's really, really exciting. But we had to incorporate those community requirements into our actual project planning in order to do that. And I think that's what it takes. And so we just need to replicate that and continue building on it and achieve our social goals at the same time.
Renee, one of the stakeholders that we haven't talked a lot about is the final consumer of these minerals that we're discussing, whether that's your immediate client or that's the company buying, the individual buying an electric vehicle. I hear a lot that consumers generally are now more invested in understanding the supply chain, that really want to know throughout every phase of production, including mineral inputs, that environmental considerations are being taken into account. Is that true? If so, how does that kind of filter to the level of the first company involved in this value chain, which is a company like yours mining the critical raw material? Is that a real trend? How is that registering, and how does that affect the decisions you're making downstream?
No, absolutely. I think that sustainability care is something that is also shared by the final consumer. We are producing, something that is not going directly to the final consumer, and so we are intermediate phases, but even though this is not a final production that we make, the final consumer is also asking for sustainability and tracking, that production. So certifications, international certifications like the Copper Mark, are becoming very relevant for all of our industry, and also communicate in a different way what we do and the way in which we are producing those important resources for this new decarbonized and electrified world. So it's very relevant to change the way in which we produce, to incorporate what we have been talking during this conversation, the concept of social value, of shared prosperity, but also to communicate this in a different way. We probably have been very silent as mining companies, in the past. We have been perhaps doing the right things that were not, perhaps correct with the eyes of today, that we have to recognize, and those are the legacies that Christina was mentioning before, that we have to recognize that some decisions were perhaps not the best ones that we took in the past, but apart from that, we need to show that we have changed, that we are in a process of changing, that we are in a process of really taking very important consideration of the different way in which we are operating, and the value that we are giving for all these concepts that are very relevant to this final consumer that you are mentioning. But we need to be much more proactive, much more vocal in the way in which we approach, our customers, but more just the customers, the whole, society, the whole social environment that surrounds us, not just the community that lives, very close to our operations, but also people that doesn't understand so far how we operate, and need also to give much more credibility on the way in which we are really changing the way in which we are producing. This is a challenge. We are in some countries, there are a lot of challenges in terms of also public opinion that is not very favorable, to extractive industries like mining, where we need, to perhaps as industry, apart from the effort that every company is doing with their own constituency to have, a joint effort to really show the way in which we are changing.
Without giving too many acronyms, I am curious to hear, Renee, just a bit more from you about these certification processes, the use of big data, ways that this new environmental consciousness that we're seeing expressed by consumers and the companies that are using these mineral inputs for their industrial products are able to find out and have more visibility on the water use, the energy use, other environmental and social impacts from mining. What sort of data are you producing now that you might not have produced before in order to reach certain standards and certifications in order to reassure the consumers of these minerals?
Yeah, well, as company, as an industry, we are also trying to bring much more data and information to the public eyes. So being much more transparent and being much more, I would say, proactive in the way we communicate what we are doing, what amount of electricity are we using, what of those is renewable, what the amount of water that we're using, how much of that is desalinated. So there's a lot of things that perhaps were just natural for the industry, but really not. We didn't gave that information the importance that they have to be also shared with our constituency. So the certification processes, for instance, put us in a way in a different level where you need to provide all this information, not just for the certification companies, but also to the public domain, so that everyone can really see that what you are saying, it's coherent with when the figures that you are publishing, and there are a lot of efforts in this line that providing much more transparency and giving I would say some coherence to our speech. It will be empty if we do not match what we are saying that we are doing with real examples and being much more transparent, opening the doors of our industry also so that the final consumers and society can also see us in a different way and check that what we are really showing as a transformation in our industry is really real.
Jenna, sometimes when we think about where the United States should look to obtain minerals for critical supply chains, you hear this expression friendshoring, but nobody tells us who our friends are, right? It's not exactly clear, which companies, which countries, which provinces are adhering to the kinds of values that we are talking about here. And the State Department doesn't publish a list of it, but you are engaged in the field, visiting companies, visiting, and speaking with governments. What are the tools like the certifications that Renee was just describing? What are the ways that those who care about these issues can feel more reassured that companies are meeting the standards they're describing, that governments are adhering to the values that would classify them as the kind of friends that we should be moving our value chains toward?
Yeah, a lot of this work is work that we're currently engaging with our partners under the Mineral Security Partnership with. So I said this is a group of countries looking to catalyze investment in specific projects, but those projects need to adhere to really high ESG standards. And so in our work and looking through, at projects in provinces and countries, we're really also trying to figure out like, what does this mean from an ESG perspective actually? Because it's one thing to say high ESG standards. It's another thing to figure out, based on the previous conversation, what that means in terms of standards, what that means in terms of what companies are reporting, things like that. We're working with the government of Canada to kind of parse this a little bit and figure out, what kind of ESG framework should we apply to projects that we're jointly looking to catalyze investment into. There's a lot of these, right? There's UN guiding principles, there's OECD guidelines, there's folks like IRMA, and we're MSP and its partners are really trying to draw on these standards to figure out, what is appropriate to apply. But I think it's an interesting question because I don't think it's any specific government or any specific person or any specific province. It really, like I said before, has to do with, how are these projects being conducted in these areas, and how do they adhere to ESG standards? And then also from the government perspective, the work we're doing, do governments actually not just pay lip service, but do we see that in the way that governments are managing their sectors, in the way that they're governing their extractive sectors? Are they focused on these issues? And so from my perspective, a friend is anyone who can, who can walk this line, right? But I think it's interesting. One example that we like to highlight is what SQM was doing in Chile, which when they joined IRMA, began an independent audit earlier this year of against mining standards, to essentially signal to the world that this is that they really take seriously community engagement, health, safety, and that all of these things are a really big deal for minerals production in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so I think you do see governments and companies moving this way, and I think that is sending a signal to governments like the United States, to others in MSP, but also to companies like those here today, that they're serious about these things. And I think that's kind of what we think about when we think about friends. It's friends who also value the same ESG principles that we do.
We just have a few minutes left. I want to give everyone a chance to have some final remarks. One topic I think that we haven't touched on is what we're mining. We've talked a lot about how we're mining, but a question is, are the minerals that we're now thinking about extracting in places like Latin America different perhaps than before, in a way that reflects the needs of the energy transition, in a way that reflects the urgency that the United Nations says we need to apply to the energy transition, given how far we are from meeting our climate targets at the moment. So we'll start with you, Brianna, we'll go to you, Christina, and then we'll end with you, Renee. Go right ahead.
It's often a question that we get around, like, what's Newmont's role right now in the current transition to the greener economy? And as I talked about before, like, as decarbonization increases, I really think there is a need to support those transitions through mining and manufacturing, and that we will continue to have a need for raw materials. Gold has some portion of a role. Copper probably has a larger portion of a role. We have these large stable mines that have some access to copper, and I think we'll continue to focus on looking at both of those in our production, and what that looks like. I think what's important to talk about, though, is as we're mining and as we're looking at those, that it's not just important to look at what the asset is and what you're mining, but it's also important to look at how you're mining and make sure that we're really looking at, including things like circular economy into the way that we do work, really looking at how do we minimize our footprint, both in terms of emissions, in terms of water, in terms of nature, in the way that we evaluate and look at projects. And that I think we will continue to look for jurisdictions and project areas that are aligned with our values as we move forward. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Thanks, Brianna. Christina.
Thanks, looking for my unmute button. So on the what, Anglo made the decision to shift its portfolio to a more appropriate portfolio for the green economy that is to come. And so we pulled out of thermal coal. Copper is critical to us, and we are, producers of nickel and iron ore, which will be key for steel. We've signed a partnership with ThyssenKrupp to look at new technologies to produce low carbon steel, which will be key for us to reduce our emissions into the future. And so, yes, our portfolio is shifting to the needs of the future. I think final point from me about the needs of the future. Without mining, we're not going to have a green economy. And all the accessories of modern life are just so reliant on mining. And society, we as an industry, but also society, need to understand that a bit better and recognize it, so that the whole chain is better informed, and there is the pull from consumers and governments are fully aware, and then mining companies can be involved and our suppliers, so that everyone recognizes the criticality of our industry, and then we can focus on the what and the how in the best way, and have that right balance of carrot and stick, or I'm going to go to Jenna's race to the top. You know, that's what we need to motivate. And after so many years, you know, in the industry, like all the other panelists, we that's still so relatively unknown. And that's what I'd really like to see change, and that will accelerate the transformation in our industry, I think.
Renee, final words.
Well, in 30 seconds, we, as I mentioned before, we take the decision to go into the future-facing commodities, as we mentioned, you know, copper, nickel, iron ore, and natural fertilizers, which are, in our view, crucial for this new decarbonized electrified world, and also in terms of for food security in the case of natural fertilizer also. So we move away from coal, we move away from oil. We sold our participations in those industries just to focus on that. We think that this is a coherent with the approach that we have shared, and the Americas plays an important role, you know, in this future-facing commodities production, as we mentioned, copper particularly, you know, in the Americas, but also natural fertilizers. We know a big production that with our big investment that we are making in Canada. So we think that this is the way in which the world is heading, and we as a key player in the resources industry, we are convinced that this is the future, and we are heading towards that.
Wonderful. We are out of time. Please allow me to thank all of you again. Let me thank Newmont for its generous partnership with the Wilson Center. Let me thank Anglo and BHP for sharing expertise. I thank the US Department of State for loaning us Jenna for an hour for this excellent conversation. I thank our audience for its interest in Latin America's mining sector, both as a potential engine of economic recovery, a source of jobs, a source of hard currency exports, a source of minerals needed for the global energy transition, but also taking seriously the issues that we've just discussed today, meaning the social and environmental impacts and the challenges that we discuss about raising mining output while reducing the impacts on the communities throughout the Americas. We'll continue to focus on these subjects moving forward. And so please continue to give us your attention as we work through all of these critical social, environmental, and economic issues. Again, thank you so much for being here. Christina, Brianna, Renee, Jenna.